Throughout the world, migration has become the issue on which elections are decided. Why? And what does that tell us about ourselves? Welcome to the Balie. My name is Veronica Baas. I'm program editor here and I will be moderating this evening. And we will be talking about borders and belonging. And that also just happens to be the title of this book, written by Hiroshi Motomura. Welcome. Very happy that you're here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes. A renowned American migration scholar. And the topic could not be more topical, of course. In Los Angeles, there have been protests and riots against deportations of migrants. And then Trump sent in the National Guard without approval of the governor, leading to an unprecedented situation. And in the Netherlands, well, last week, our government fell because some people still joining. Please just sit at the back. Yes. The government fell because Geert Wilders, the leader of the biggest party, he felt that his demands on the topic of migration were not met swiftly enough. It's a topical topic. It's also a popular topic because we cannot go around it, I guess. And whether you think that migration is a crisis or not, the fact is that it often feels like a crisis. And tonight we will be talking about what borders mean, what it tells us about ourselves, and why borders and migration are so easily politicized. Hiroshi Motomura wrote this great book, and he was brought to my attention by Martijn Strongs of de Vrije Universiteit, and he is also the one who will introduce this work to all of you. Can I have a warm applause for Martijn Strongs?
So it's great that so many people are here now. Also my students. So Borders and Belonging is in many ways a timely book. Motomura writes, this book may seem like it's written by two authors in honest conversation with each other. One accepts the constraints of coarse politics, and the other embraces noble ideas. This tension may be inherent in any effort to deal forthrightly with a complex topic that can prompt serious thoughts, controversy, and even polarization. Working with the tension between approaches, Motomura tries, to sketch a realistic utopia, to offer a framework for crucial choices. A realistic utopia, that is certainly something politics desperately needs nowadays, I would think. Realistic politics fueled by aspirational values based on what Motomura calls humanity claims. Such a utopia seems far away. If one follows the developments in migration law, as I do for a profession, one might sometimes be overwhelmed by rather dystopian images of pushbacks on the Mediterranean, of people living in deplorable circumstances in camps in Greece, of asylum seekers being held for years in procedures. In the Netherlands, as already mentioned, the second government in a row fell on the topic of asylum and migration. Geert Wilders demanded to entirely close off the Dutch borders. For asylum seekers, he insisted on border control by the army. Syrians with an asylum permit would have to leave the country within half a year. And the Dutch citizens with double nationality convicted for serious crimes would be stripped of their nationality and deported. It is easy to describe contemporary right-wing migration policy as a realistic dystopia. Migration and asylum has become a game of who is the fiercest and the strictest. This has real effects. The policy proposals have further dehumanized asylum seekers, making it normal to claim that they cannot live with their family, should wait for years in asylum centers, or that recognized refugees should be sent back to Syria before we have ascertained that the situation there is stable and safe. Yet in many ways, contemporary populist migration policies are more surreal than real. Take, for example, the border controls that Wilders has demanded. The Netherlands Court of Audit, the Rekenkamer, concluded that this will not lead to less migration, for the simple reason that irregular migrants who are stopped at the Dutch border may not be returned because they can ask for asylum legally. So European and international law prohibits this. And when Wilders said that other countries, such as Germany, are doing this, as a matter of fact, and they are allowed to do so, and that we have to be more strict in not to be the weakest kid in Europe. That is also not true, because in Germany, was it a couple of weeks ago, the German court decided that it was contrary to European law, the Dublin regulation. So there are legal and also practical problems with these kind of proposals, and in that sense they're surreal. So populist migration policies sound firm, they have real symbolic effects on the way we perceive and treat people, but they have little effect in reality as to the explicit aims they pursue. So you could sum them up as total control of migration, zero asylum seekers, no crime, no family members. But the complex system of administrative, constitutional, national, European and international law prevents this, just as a logic and as practice. To give another example, if you want less work for the immigration service, you might want to take away the incentive to start new procedures. This was the reason, in the beginning of this millennium, of this century, that the Netherlands introduced the one status system. Every ground for protection, every asylum ground for protection, would lead to one status with the same rights and entitlements. The reason? It turned out that the earlier system, that there was an incentive, if you got a weaker status, to start proceedings to get a stronger one. What's the proposal of this cabinet? They want to reintroduce a two-status system. What will be the result? More procedures, so more work for immigration service and judges, so more, so higher workload for the IND, which is already overburdened. So that is another example of something which becomes, which has not the sort of effects that are intended. You could say that contemporary migration policy often takes the form of unrealistic dystopias, which primary outcome is symbolic, the dehumanization of asylum seekers and other outsiders. Precisely at this moment in time, the moment of such unrealistic symbolic dystopias, I think Motomura's book is timely. First of all, because Motomura doesn't fall in the trap of the sociologist, of lawyer, who repeats, as I've just done as well, that certain policies are unrealistic, or they cannot become true, or are in violations of laws and regulations. That is the sort of standard response nowadays to these right-wing proposals. Of course, such interventions are important, but what Motomura does in his book is more profound. Patiently, and in very lucid sentences, he discusses why certain proposals are wrong. If one focuses too much on why something is impossible, as a matter of fact, or as a result of prevailing rules, one could forget the question whether it's the right thing to do or not. Motomura's book is ethical in that sense. He discusses why some outsiders might have claims to come to a country, why undocumented migrants can become insiders of a country, what are the arguments for regularization of long-time residing undocumented migrants, why human beings should be able to live with their families, and why migrants cannot be made to wait eternally in procedures or in in-between statuses. Motomura, so to speak, brings back the utopian in the discussions about migration policies to strive for ethical borders. But, and that is the second reason why Motomura's book is timely, he does so without losing sight of the political reality. Borders and Belonging is not merely a utopian book. Utopia literally means non-place, a place that cannot be reached, in the same way as one never reaches the horizon. But a horizon can give direction, just as a utopia can. And this is what Motomura tries to do with his project. From the realism of the nation-state with borders, he strives for better and more just borders. But he takes seriously the belonging claims of those who are already present within a country. And he also takes seriously dominant economic and cultural considerations and the limitations to the capacity of a country to receive asylum seekers. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, wrote Goethe, and in a similar vein, Motomura's book is written by two authors, a realist and a utopian. This double-sensed approach is important because it brings back the complexity of politics and law, taking issue with the simplicity of the populist and right-wing rhetorics. In this sense, one could say Motomura's project is truly agonistic, emphasizing the importance of conflict and struggle in political life. But he also, and this is yet another temporal value of the book, endeavors to bring back the value of patience, deliberation, and consideration for the long term in the politics of migration. One of the striking aspects of contemporary migration law is that it perceives, and it has been mentioned, as a permanent form of crisis. Crisis which beg for immediate action that provides results today or tomorrow, the latest. Motomura's patient approach asks us to think properly, to see the complexity of issues, to acknowledge that the remedy is to be found in slow and long-term solutions. Crises are the fuel of populist and right-wing politics. In the Netherlands, we have had the refugee crisis, the reception crisis, the crisis inter Apel, not to mention the nitrogen, stikstof crisis, the housing crisis, the benefit scandal, the childcare crisis, the climate crisis, and let's say the crisis of democracy. If the fuel of populism is crisis, then it's clear that resolving the underlying issues is not in the interest of populist politics. Motomura writes in his book about the infamous US-Mexico border wall that Donald Trump championed. Opponents usually critique the wall as cruel, ineffective, and a call to hate, which are all reasonable points in themselves. But they did little to emphasize that the $25 million which has been used to build the beginning of the wall could also be used for training and education for hundreds of thousands of US workers. Opponents didn't ask enough about the trade-off. What's better? Spending money on walls or spending money on schools? In the Netherlands, just as in many countries in Europe, the government says that it's facing inevitable government cuts on education, affordable housing, social welfare, and healthcare. But who is counting the cost of the unrealistic dystopias that have been central to migration politics? Some examples. Reintroduction of border controls in the EU is estimated to cost 25 to 15 billion euros. That's once, and then every year another 2 billion. The cost of emergency shelter for asylum seekers in the Netherlands is almost 70,000 euro per year per person, whilst it's 30,000 euro per year in regular reception centers. So this, the cost of 70,000 is because it's emergency shelter. So emergency reception in hotels, which also happens, is 91,000 euro per year. Money that could also have been spent to durable reception centers in the Netherlands, in accordance with, for example, the new Spreidingswet. The cost of penalties that have to be paid to asylum seekers, yet another example, because these procedures take too long. 3.4 billion euro. So these are all examples of money that's been spent which has not very clear results and could have been spent differently. So I think Motomura's book is a very timely book, and it aims to be precisely the medicine against the crisis rhetorics that have become so dominant in migration politics in the last decade or so. But there's one prevailing question. So how do we get politics from the dominant populist rhetorics and dystopias towards the reasonable, realistic utopias and the complexities that Motomura defends? So my question is this, Hiroshi. You have written a reasonable book, a realist utopia, but what is your recipe for hope and optimism?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Martijn Stronks, the head of the Amsterdam Center of Migration and Refugee Law. And while I'm introducing, I will introduce everyone sitting here at my table as well. Hiroshi Motomura, we just had a roaring introduction of your book, but in daily life you're a migration scholar working at the UCLA School of Law. I already said that I'm glad that you're here. I'm also glad that Matthew Longo is here, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Leiden University, teaching political theory, focusing on problems with borders and migration, and through the lens of the questions of sovereignty, authority, and freedom. Also very happy that you're here.
Thank you very much.
I will start with the book. Hiroshi, if we are looking at the picture on the cover of the book, what are we looking at?
So this picture was taken at the moment that my mother and I left Japan. I was born in Japan, and my father went to America first, only a few years before, and he saved his money to buy a boat ticket. And he sent it to us, and I was 3 years old. That's me in the picture. And that was the moment at which my mother was saying goodbye to her parents, and she wouldn't see them again for 11 years. And some of you are the age like me where you remember what an aerogram is. An aerogram was the prepaid piece of paper that you fold and you communicate. That's the way they communicated for those 11 years.
Yeah. And how do you think that your personal... I'm sorry, I feel it touches you. I can imagine.
Well, it does and it doesn't. But I think that the photograph is actually a method of full disclosure. That on the one hand, I think that all of us who write about migration say something that comes from our own experience. And so I don't have the picture or the book only spends one paragraph on my family history. But I want people to know that this may have an influence. And it's not because I'm trying to claim any more persuasive power. I think it's because I want people to understand there may be something I say in the book, and the reader might say, oh, that's why he said it, or that must have had an influence. So I feel it's seriously a statement of full disclosure. And then it's a cliche to say I've been writing this book my whole life. But in some senses, that's true, because it reflects my own experience as a immigrant child, 3 years old, coming to America, not knowing any English, and then making my way. Also at a time when I think the society has changed quite a bit with regard to immigration. So in that sense, my first thought was that it's strangely narcissistic to put your own family photo on the book, but I also felt that it actually makes sense.
Yeah. And you say you've been writing this book for your whole life.
Yeah.
By training, you're a lawyer, but it's not a legal book. Like, why is it important to you to reach out to so many disciplines?
I think that goes to really why I wrote the book, which is that this is, I think, in all writing, maybe by academics or maybe by anybody, I've seen everything I've written and published has been a correction to something that was inadequate about what I had written before. So I wrote a book about how the United States treated migrants and whether they were seen as future Americans or not. They became the book Americans in Waiting. But I had colleagues say, well, what about irregular migrants? They're not in the book. And I said, well, that's got to be another book. So I corrected that by writing a book about irregular migration. And then at the end of that book, I said, there's so many things, honestly, in my whole career I haven't dealt with. This book is an attempt to bring together strands that, frankly, I was a little afraid to confront because I'm not trained as an economist. I'm not trained as a philosopher. And yet, so much writing, maybe even thinking about migration, is in silos, thought silos. It could be political, it could be discipline, it could be geographical. And I wanted to essentially take the chance to try to bring these together, knowing that there was a risk. So that's how I'm trying to both, here's the tough balance. I'm trying to go beyond my limitations of being a legally trained person. But at the same time, I want to make sure I talk about things I know. So I'm trying to write about the things I know, which is about the United States principally and about law principally. But I'm trying to bring in so many other things that are relevant and which I feel maybe my biggest contribution is to bring people together. So let's have the economists talk to the philosophers, the anthropologists talk to lawyers, so forth.
Well, we have a political theorist here at the table, so that's great. Because you do start really fundamental in the book. It's called Borders and Belonging, and I also want to start at that first part, which is called Borders. Matthew, can I ask you the very broad question? Like, how do you look at borders? Like, through your research, what have you found out to be the meaning of borders?
Yeah, thank you. So I actually want to start with something Martijn said, to riff a little bit on Hiroshi's book in answering this question. So one way to think of what Hiroshi argues is this idea of realism and utopianism, which is there in the book. But to understand a little bit about what he means by that are these two claims he starts out with, right? There's this claim he calls claim of humanity, which Martijn mentioned. And the other is what he calls claims of belonging. And this is this intersection point that I think really clarifies more or less the whole problem of borders in different ways, right? So claims of humanity in this sense are everything we could claim that we deserve, let's say, by dint of personhood, by our humanity, right? So it's a universal claim. All of us equally can enjoy the rights that might follow, say, from that claim. And the particular is different, right? So the claims of belonging really are about the fact that you are Dutch, that you're American, you have a nation, you have a religion, you have a community. That is something that, by nature, any community, even if we think of communities very positively as these warm, loving spaces, are ultimately exclusionary, right? They're necessarily exclusionary unless the community is the whole world, which takes you back to humanity. And so that tension, right, between claims that everyone is owed and those that only some are owed by dint of membership in some kind of community is what a border is, right? It's where the one abuts the other. You are inside until you aren't, right? And so the question that's coming up about these problems is that there's always something utopian about claims of humanity, the idea that we owe things in this very perfectly universal global sense, given that most of us believe we do, or we ought to believe, we care equally about all people. But then there's this other problem, which is that in reality, we have communities and families and memberships that create affective ties that end up being very strong and quite enduring. That tension between those affective ties and the things we ought to believe globally is where the border comes in. So on some level, the border is just the institution, the instantiation of that tension. But you know, one of the nice things about studying borders, and this certainly comes out in my work, my first book was about the US-Mexico border. I know a lot of what Hiroshi talks about, and this is a subject that interests me a great deal. So the US-Mexico border, in some sense, seems like the most fraught example of this, right? This place that people are quite explicitly saying, I mean, listen to Trump's rhetoric, right? I mean, it's not just build a wall, make Mexico pay for it. It's almost like it's a parody. But that's where the realness comes in, right? That there's some fact, there's some belief that he's tapping into about us and them. But the closer you come to a border, as I did in my own research, in looking at borders, of course you find that that kind of rhetoric, of course it plays really well in the media. At the border, there are all different kinds of affective ties. Lots of affective ties are cross-border. There are interlinked cities, often called sister cities, for example. So on the US-Mexico border, you might talk about Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, you have El Paso, Tijuana, you have El Paso, Juarez, you have Tijuana, San Diego. You have lots of examples of this. It's true of every kind of border area. But you also have trade. You have border communities that are bilingual. You also have institutions that are shared, right? They're not all good. It's not all just bilingual education. I mean, you have collaboration between ICE, for example, and Mexican officials or Canadian officials. All kinds of things happen. They're often terrible. They're often in the service of these states that are trying to clamp down on the rights of others, right? But they also have all these kind of potentialities for something good, in the sense that those affective ties, the border from afar looks like it's obvious. We're all inside and you're all outside. Until you're at the border and you realize affective ties cross the border all the time. Right? So all the things that from afar make borders very easy to exploit by politicians are exactly the things that from up close you start to see these kind of potentials. And I think that's why, just to come back to this point and the way Hiroshi frames it, I think it's the right way to frame it, because I think that's how you have to ask. How do you go about cultivating effective ties across borders such that they stop being so obviously tools of rhetorical separation?
Yeah, because I want to remain with the positive effects of borders for a little longer before we delve into those obvious tools. Like Hiroshi, like what are you write you're not a cosmopolitist in that sense, utopian. Like, what do you think that national borders really bring us?
As a positive, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I try to explain in the first chapter is other situations that are like borders, I'll explain that in a second. But really, where I come out is that borders can work for some good, and borders are often weaponized to do some very seriously bad things. And so, what are the good things? So, each of the types of borders that I talk about there are many borders in our lives, and we don't think of them the same way, I mean, psychologically or politically as national borders, but the family is a border, interestingly. The family home is a border. I mean, there's certainly an inside or an outside. A university has a border, and there's a lot of contest over what should be the criteria for getting in, but that's also a border. And so Native American tribes is another example. So there's this sense that in the utopian world, we have insiders and outsiders, but that line is not used in a cruel way. It is a border that it provides for culture, for agency, for a certain degree of empowerment, but isn't used in ways that are used to normalize injustice. And so I think those aspects of, it's sort of what Matthew, what you're saying is that there are things that can come up that can result from borders that are good. But in saying this, I realize that everything I say, in a sense, goes against millennia of history, right? In other words, that borders have a bad track record. But I do think that it's useful to think about other zones of exclusion. And I was asked the other day, how would I explain national borders to a 10-year-old? And one natural thing might be to look at a map and say you have these lines and this sort of thing. But where I went, and I'm not sure, this is just something I just thought of immediately, and maybe on reflection I could take it back, although it's kind of stayed with me, and that is that there are many times in our lives when we feel we belong or we feel we don't belong. And national border is just one of those things. And the reason that I think it helps is that it helps us see the potential. I think it both helps us see what borders might do that are good or how might one defend them, but it also helps and crystallizes more what's wrong with them.
Yeah, because these borders in a way also obscure injustices also within societies. What do you mean with that?
Well, just to give you a few examples, there are things that the government officials can do to you at a border that they cannot do to you, at least I hope they can't, inside the country. They can inspect your luggage, they can look at your mobile phone and your laptop and that kind of thing, and there's a lot of more latitude for government intervention. If you take that even one step further, there can be racial and religious prejudice affecting decisions about who to let in the country. But it's easy, as we've seen in our current president of the United States, to say, well, this is all national security. So there's so many situations where border control is a place where the government has more discretion in a way that can be used in a very discriminatory way. So what might be inappropriate with regard to freedom of speech or racial discrimination, religious discrimination, gender discrimination, what might be inappropriate in those contexts. There's so many times, it's on the daily news every day, when something is justified. Well, it's at the border. We can do it. And that's what's going on because, and Matthew, this gets back to something you were just saying, that I think that view of the border is very much an insider-outsider view. But part of what I'm trying to advance in this book is an idea that it's not just about protecting against invaders. It's really about listening to claims of justice inside the country, where people will have a debate about who to let in, who not to let in. But the idea really there is that let's have the system of justice that is not this exceptional. I guess it's been called by well-known writers a zone of exception, or that's the problem that I see. I guess that's because you're asking an important question, so that's a way of addressing it.
Yeah, because we've mentioned these claims of belonging for a few times now, and I was wondering, in a way, it says it's the way to justify your right to be inside a certain border. But it feels that in current political situation, it is also up to the people inside a certain border to decide who else doesn't have a claim to belonging. And also, Matthew, what you were just saying, that those claims of belonging are not just, they don't stop outside of the border. Sometimes people do have a claim of belonging, but they just find themselves on the other side of the border.
Yeah, well, this is what's so insidious about a lot of right-wing politics right now. I mean, so I know one of the threads that Martijn brought up, and maybe we'll talk about in general, is the fact that it's very easy to exploit the border rhetorically and politically, in particular for populist aims. And there's a lot of harms, right? So one of the obvious harms, of course, is anybody who's on the outside being excluded. But, rhetorically, a lot of the problem is actually internal, which is to say that what the border does is it generates a very obviously justifiable security impetus, in the sense that once you create this inside-outside, once the outsiders are the aliens, they're the barbarians at the gates, what happens? It becomes a security concern, becomes militarized. It's very easy to justify, once the person on the outside is a barbarian, border funding, security funding, and actually incredibly militaristic language, right? They have to actually become vilified and othered. This always happens in wars, right? Where people turn into cockroaches, or this idea that you have to make the other so dehumanized they can become expendable. So part of what's so insidious about this politics is that on the one hand, you have this plausibly justifiable claim, right? That there is something to be protected about a community that so easily gets exploited rhetorically towards all these horrible things where the other becomes... So an example of the barbarian in the US-Mexico context that I think was so stark, I don't know how many people in the room remember, I'm sure you remember, when the problem was the migrant caravan. This idea there was like hordes, and there were these images of these looks like, kilometers long, and they really looked like the barbarians at the gates, the idea that you can imagine the steppes and marauders on horseback. I mean, this is the enemy. Once you militarize it, the obvious thing that you vilify the other leads very quickly to the other side of the coin, right? Which is that all the things you have at home start to become militarized as well. People are very often surprised at how we get to what's happening now in LA, for example, right? Where you see really militarism. It's all the same story, right? Once you create the barbarian and you justify the military extension, it's natural to say, well, if the barbarian's already in our territory, then we use the military at home. It's completely natural, logically, that move. But so it's completely candy to this kind of community. And unfortunately, there's no way around its attractiveness, right? The idea that it's going to be exploited, it's always been exploited. I mean, this is, as you said, it's hard to be, there's a lot of history that tells us this will always happen unless we're vigilant against it.
This is why we have thousands of troops in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles now. And it's also why I believe the word that comes up most often in all the executive orders that we have seen out of the White House since January 20th, the word that comes up most often is invasion.
Right.
So this then leads to invasion, insurrection, and that has legal overtones, but it also, in a more narrative and rhetorical sense, is really about, well, we need to call up the Marines and the National Guard to a situation that was...
You're a director of a center of migration law in Los Angeles.
That's right.
Where this is happening right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how... Is it, to me, it's still shocking and unexpected.
Yeah.
Is it also for you?
It is, although I've been in Europe during I was saying to colleagues in Los Angeles earlier today that every time I leave the country something bad happens, but the fact is something bad has been happening every week, so I'm not sure how much predictive value that is. But yeah, it's scary to see military vehicles going down the freeway where in a normal life we'd just be sitting in traffic, and I think it's very scary. But it's also something that I think the White House is actually quite thrilled about, because it is really just proving the point, right? And I think if these things lead to escalation, unfortunately. And so that a lot of it is what Matthew's talking about is taking place in Los Angeles right now. But we shouldn't. It's not just the troops. That's the other thing. It's not just the troop. It's really not paying attention to. Constraints, I think legal constraints on troop behavior, on searches, and then more fundamentally is ignoring orders by the courts that certain deportations need to be reversed because you sent someone to prison in El Salvador without giving him a day in court.
Yeah. So we've just heard how easy it is to exploit borders, also politically with rhetoric. But you also address in your book that it's still necessary to take seriously the concerns of those who are inside the borders, who might have these views that they are against migrants. How do you think about that balance?
So here's how I think about it is that...
We're just looking at the picture of the wife of Abrego Garcia, the guy who was sent to El Salvador.
That's right, that's
yeah.
right. There's a couple of ways to address this. I mean, one is that I think of, and I'm drawing here upon, I think, economic consensus, that if you look at the whole of the economy of the receiving country, the destination country, there's a positive effect of migrants, especially, this is another element that's important, the dimension of time, especially if you think of the second generation, the third generation, things of that nature. There's a prosperity that's created, right? And then, but there are people who feel that the prosperity has been left behind, has left them behind, that they're not getting their fair share of it. So I think one of the, we could almost say blind spots of some immigrants' rights advocates in the United States is to say, immigration helps everyone, and over time we will all prosper. I mean, I think that's true over time, but I think that the problem is that to take that attitude too cavalierly, without taking concerns seriously, creates vulnerabilities politically, right? I mean, it makes it possible for Donald Trump to come in and say, I'm for you, not these other people, not these elitist people with more money, and then really become, to claim to be a working class champion, and although clearly a lot of his policies, I think, are helping billionaires and not working people. But I think that creates a political vulnerability. So I think that it's important to take those claims seriously. It's what Martijn was talking about with regard to it's not just it's a waste of money to spend money on the wall, but think of what this money could do for your communities. And I think that, you know, I have to admit, some of this is also practical politics on my part. I mean, this is I guess what a political strategy would say. Why are you going to allow yourself to be perceived as turning your back on so many people? Other people, though, I have to say, I mean, have pushed back on my views on this by saying, well, you're pandering to racists. And I think that, but I'll say it, that I think there's a lot of racists who are concerned about, who talk about economic harm, but I think not all people who talk about economic harm are racists. And I think that there's a lot of, I think the Democratic Party in the United States has, I think, rightly rethought is how to think about this more in terms of economic equality, how to think about the merger of racial justice, among other things, with economic justice. You know, maybe this is the space that Bernie Sanders would have occupied had he become the Democratic nominee.
Yeah. How do you look at that?
It's hard not to think. I mean, I have a couple of reactions to what Hiroshi just said. You know, rhetorically, part of the problem is precisely what Hiroshi said, which is that, of course, there's a mismatch between the general fact that we know economically there are all these huge numbers of statistics above studies that are revealing that ultimately, on aggregate over time, immigration is a boon for society. Undisputed. It's actually, economically, it seems to be as undisputed as saying that there's climate change in terms of climate science, right? But there's that other fact, which is that people lose their jobs all the time. They often don't know why. Maybe maybe you're working at a stamping factory and you see a person in that job who comes from somewhere else. You might blame that other person, whether there's facticity to it. The whole problem is that the way in which we convey these messages, speaking from the vantage of democratic politics in the US, always seems to come off as talking down to the person stamping who lost their job. Talking down in the sense of, oh, you don't know why you lost your job, right? We know. And that never works.
Right.
It has nothing to do actually with populism. It's incredibly poor strategically to tell people you should vote for them because we know better for you than you do for yourself, because God forbid you understand anything about why you lost your job. Added to the second fact, which is that whether or not there's some economic basis behind it, all of us, you don't have to be working class at a stamping factory who lost your job, we all create justificatory narratives for why things happen in our lives. And if you did lose your job, it's really helpful to have someone to blame. And so this person coming in from Washington, some fancy economist saying, well, all the numbers tell me this isn't the thing you just experienced, will always lose to the person who said, yeah, but I just experienced it, I saw it. And in that sense, I don't really know what to say about it, which is that you can't let that kind of cynicism win. It's not just about populism at that point, right? It's really a much broader point about you can't allow people to lose sight of the reality of their suffering and not feel diminished by the politics that's beautifully there to help them. That's how I would respond to this. There's a lot of different levels of the problem that has actually nothing to do with the question of pandering to racists or economics at all.
But some of this, too, is that a lot of the measures, I think, that would be necessary to truly make a contribution to address the concerns of people who feel like losing their jobs, whether immigration is the actual cause or not. I mean, we see this in the trade context as well, international trade context. The political dilemma is that some of those measures would then, at least in the United States, be dismissed as creeping socialism. Right? You want to spend money on schools? What could be worse than that? And so that's a dilemma. But I'm also the person who's less optimistic says this is the dilemma that we're defining, right? But the person who's has a slight optimism is that these in the political system like the United States, it feels like a winner-take-all system, and so we're only talking about a very significant a percentage of the electorate, which I think matters, even though we're not talking about changing the minds of 30% of the people, right? I think that there's a political lost opportunity, and the person a part of me that wants to, try to make better policy says, why don't we share the prosperity that immigration brings in a way that's more visible and has more political currency. Joe Biden had an infrastructure project that really created jobs in states that voted for Trump, but he did very little actually to talk about it. It's really a tragedy that he allowed himself to be painted into certain corners, And by the way, I say this, and this is a more general comment, is I wrote the book about the United States, the book is about law, but I wrote much of the book while living in Europe, and so I'm seeing a lot of analogous situations in Europe that I didn't write about in the book because honestly I didn't feel I knew enough about them. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I feel like there are analogs in other societies, given obviously differences. But they're I want people to look at the book and say, yeah, it's not about something that's exactly in this country, but now that reminds me of something that is.
Yeah, I actually want to go to a European and also a historical example of, because Matthew, you just described how borders have been taken advantage of for a long time, and they have created insiders and outsiders forever. But you also wrote this book, The Picnic, A Dream of Freedom and the Challenge and the Collapse of the Iron Curtain. Can you tell us a little bit about how that specific border, whether that functioned in the same way politically as the border we've been discussing right now, especially the people who were coming across it?
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about it. So on the one hand, of course, I'm happy to talk about it because I've spent so many years of my life thinking about it. I mean, these things take time to produce. It's been in my head forever. But it's also just a positive story, right? So this is about '89 and the end of the Iron Curtain. And there's a couple points of resonance, I think, with this conversation. But on the very simple starting note, I had written my first book about the U.S.-Mexico border. It's all about the building up of a border, right? The U.S.-Mexico border didn't always have, walls and drones and this kind of, drones obviously are new technology, but this kind of securitized presence. But watching it build up is incredibly depressing. And you spend years on this problem that every iteration, each time you go back to the border, gets worse. And it was really exciting, actually, to work on a story and spend all these other years researching the opposite, right? About a wall coming down. And there is a little bit of context required. So the Iron Curtain in the 80s was perhaps the most extraordinary example of exclusion, right? And so the one thing to think of is that there is some kind of commonality. So the Iron Curtain was several kilometers wide. It was at different periods. In the 50s, it involved landmines, which they actually got rid of because they were too deadly, which is a rare occurrence at borders, that someone thinks this is actually too effective at killing people. It's actually because there was flooding and therefore border guards kept dying, but whatever. And you had electric fencing, you had guards and dogs and watchtowers, and the Iron Curtain was, in some sense, this phenomenon. And yet, of course, it is ancient history now. It did fall. So I have a picture. Yeah. There isn't really, it's kind of, you have to kind of imagine it's scarier than it looks in this picture, because it just looks a little bit like a fence that's barbed wired with a watchtower and all this stuff. You have to imagine that it's this leveled through, I mean, again, kilometers, right? With basically striations of different kind of security measures. This is just the outer level of what the Iron Curtain looked like in the 80s. And how does it come down? Not by accident, but it comes down because of activism. And, you know, it's very easy to get cynical now about, for example, people in Los Angeles, you know, it feels futile. But the truth is it always felt futile, right? Oh, activism in great moments in history always start out feeling ridiculous. They feel daring. People are risking their lives. So this is a story of how this particular border comes down. To respond precisely to what Veronica's prompt, it's not just that it's an uplifting story. There's another way to think about how they're different, though, because I do think we make a kind of governing error in thinking about borders, which is that, on the one hand, like we talked about earlier, that there are these simple lines on a map that are thin and only exclusionary, right, as opposed to being thicker and having these kind of joint dimensionalities to them. But their purposes change, right? So you can look at this wall, as I just portrayed it, and think, oh, this is kind of like what the US-Mexico border is now. Scary, militarized, all these things. And yet, on some other level, it's the complete opposite, right? This is a border that was functionally, based on its purpose, the opposite. It wasn't, in particular, trying to keep the barbarians out, right? It was trying to keep people in. Think of like the Berlin Wall, right? The whole point was to keep GDR citizens from going to the West. It was stopping out migration. So what is the border system? It's equally exclusionary, but its function is fundamentally different, right? It's not keeping the barbarians out. In fact, it's less the story of barbarians at the gates than it is the wall of a prison, right? Like prison walls that are designed entirely to keep people in. Even so on the one hand, you get this kind of understanding when you look at history and borders that although they look on paper the same, like on the map they look identical, functionally they evolve, they're totally different across time. But on a different level, the story is the same. How do you protest it? You do it through activism. This particular story, I have some pictures because they're quite beautiful to give you an idea of what it looks like to actually think about taking down a border. It happened with social movements and activism. This is the story of the Pan-European Picnic. These are partygoers that threw an incredibly ostentatious, completely ridiculous, in the time, you have to imagine yourself in the time of living on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This picture is set in Hungary. This is 1980s Hungary. These are people, in the end it was 20,000 people, basically throwing a protest with speeches and songs at the border. At the site of the Iron Curtain, you can actually see the remnants of the Iron Curtain in the background. And it set the stage for this event, this incredibly moving event, which is people basically rushing through the borderlands. And won't go into depth about it because this is just to give it a sense of it, because what it does is it allows you to give a little bit of depth to the story, right? So suddenly it's not just looking at US-Mexico in the present. It's looking at what is timeless about these kind of borders versus migrants and activists. These are all East German migrants who are running out to freedom. But on the other hand, what's timely, right? Which is that there's some story of activism that is ultimately, even in completely different circumstances, entirely the same. It's ultimately the same story of border guards, refugees, political leaders, and activists.
And social movements.
And social movements.
In that context. Yeah, I'll never forget going to the section of the Berlin Wall that's still there, and there's a museum there, it's the Bernauer Straße, and I was listening to a teacher in a middle school group, and the teacher, I'll never forget this, teacher said kids, there used to be a wall here. And so I often imagine, will there be a moment, how do we get to that place where there may be a border to some extent, which is a whole other topic, but the movement or change occurs in some ways that we can say, kids, there used to be a wall here.
Right. No, it's really,
Because you're really focusing on migration policy in the book, and that obviously implies that it comes from politicians, policy makers. But do you think that the real change to imagine not a border, the US-Mexico border that is gone, but that is significantly lowered, do you think that the real change there should come from the people of Los Angeles who are now protesting against ICE?
I mean, this gets really to the question Matthew's raising, the topic of how change occurs, how social movements occurred. One of the things that's striking to me about the fall of the Berlin Wall is how the leaders of the East German government thought the wall would last forever, even up until it fell. And I think that goes to
100-year wall.
That's right. And so I think it's in a way. Your question, I think, is the natural question, and yet my answer, in a way, I'd be undercutting my answer that it takes all these things if I were to actually answer the question, right? Because that would put me in the position of saying, well, it's really going to turn on this. I think it's, during the first Trump administration, I read a really, I think, a wonderful book on abolition of slavery and the run-up to the Civil War, and I realized it was a really book about a different social movement, and it took a lot of people. But I also think it took people in positions of power. I think it took people who hopefully understood what their role might be. Right? They may be writers, they may be poets, they may be songwriters, they may be people in the streets, they may be government officials. But part of what I'm trying to do, maybe this is what drives a lot of my writing in general, is to provide some kind of a sense of, here is not the play-by-play playbook, but here is what the horizon looks like, here's what North Star looks like, here are the components by which we can judge how to make daily decisions. So the utopian, actually, although it is in the book, it's a vision of, but it's not a distant vision. It's really a guide to here's a good decision and a bad decision this week, today, and here's how to, at least my view of how to think about it being good or bad.
Yeah. Do you want to respond to that as a last response? Because then I'm going to change the tables.
I feel like last response is hard to do because there's so much to talk about. But I feel that we have so much correct cynicism. You can always talk about realism and utopianism. The question is, realist about what? And one of the things that bothers me about migration discourse is, of course, we ought to be cynical about what someone like Trump says, or all these different populist leaders with their vilification and so forth. But what upsets me is that people get very cynical about social movements, this idea that they can never achieve anything. And I was listening this morning to a podcast because I was preparing for this, and I thought, let me just find out what's happening in LA, because I had read the news and it's like, whoa, the images are terrifying of street violence. And one of the first things that came up on the podcast is the presenter basically saying, these protests aren't going to achieve anything. And, that's always true until it isn't, right? And this is the fact of this stuff. Part of what was moving about the 80s, of course, is that it worked. You see these beautiful faces of tears, but, you can't actually be cynical about social movements when they fail. One has to accept that these things take a lot of time. You see it everywhere. It's like, so a lot of climate activism, you can't be cynical about the fact that it doesn't always work. The same way about the story of what's happened with Gaza, the importance of protesting what's happening in Gaza. You can't be cynical that it doesn't always work. You have to accept that these things grow, and it's actually very unpredictable when those breakthroughs happen. And so I think that that's the way I think about it in closing, which is that while it's important to keep a certain kind of pessimist hat on about borders and about politics, you have to, if you study his stuff at all, as you said. I mean, we have a lot of history that tells us it's not going to end well, right? Except there's also a lot of history when it does. So anyways, good for the people out in LA.
And thank you so much, Matthew. I think you've also kind of answered Martijn's question, like where do we find the hope? Thank you so much for joining us for this first conversation. And I would like to ask Nanda Audians and Wafa Al-Ali to join me, and I will introduce them. Nanda Audians is Associate Professor of Philosophy of Law and Director of the College of Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Amsterdam. And she has also until 2014 served as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Advisory Committee on Migration Affairs at the Ministry of Justice and Security. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
And then the only non-academic here at the table, Wafa Al-Ali, a legal affairs journalist, but she is a legal, she did study law, a legal affairs journalist at the political desk of NRC with a specific focus on asylum. Thank you so much for being here. We will continue our conversation about migration policy and also about how politics has been reacting to these constant crises and then making maybe crises and using crises, but also perhaps there really being crises. Wafa, last week the government fell on this. Were you surprised?
In the end, I wasn't surprised. It was a long time coming that it would fall in summer. At least at our political desk, we were expecting it to fall in summer after the NATO conference in The Hague. And we expected that the Liberal Party would then let the government fall over something financial. And now our analysis is that Geert Wilders also expected this to happen from the VVD, from the Liberal Party, and that he wanted to beat them to it. And then he used his strongest topic, which is migration and specifically asylum migration.
Yeah, and that made it the second time in a row that a government fell on this topic.
It was a very unhappy marriage.
It was, yeah. Nanda, first, is there something you wanted to respond to the first conversation that is fresh in your mind? Because then we will dive into the legacy of the last government after that. But
no, I was just thinking about the activism and the social movements that brought down the Berlin Wall. You mentioned the abolition of slavery, but there is also a very good example of how the Guantanamo Bay detention center for refugees was shut down in the 1990s. So before the Guantanamo Bay became a terrorist detention center, it was a detention center for refugees who were kept indefinite without access to lawyers, without access to asylum procedures. And it was indeed a grass movement, a social movement, that activated for the close down of the center, but with the help of legal experts and lawyers from Yale. So when you're talking about activism, it's about those in power, it's about social movements, it's about grass movements, but also those who know law and who are legal experts to fight for the rights of those who are denied rights. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm not a lawyer.
A philosopher. Yeah. Wafa, yeah, because if you let us look at the legacy of the last government and the role that migration and asylum has played in that, we've heard it's been mentioned before. There's this constant claim to crisis. I think maybe people know it as well, but how much is this a political crisis, and how much is this an actual crisis on the ground in the Netherlands?
It's a fabricated crisis, but now that it has been taking for 3 years already, it started in the summer of 2022, at least this is the starting point that I choose. Since 3 years, it has been a fabricated crisis that has evolved into an actual political crisis. So in my work, I always insisted on writing down that it's not an asylum crisis, it's a crisis of asylum shelter. Because there's a lack of enough asylum beds in the country, and instead of focusing on solving this problem and motivating municipalities to come through with spots for shelter, I see that politicians actually contribute to decreasing the support for asylum protection in the Netherlands. And I hear also from local administrators that the rhetoric that is being used in The Hague is actually not helping their efforts to solve their the problem that they see on the ground. Because then, for example, right-wing parties in local municipalities, they just say, well, look at the parliament and the government, they don't want this, so why should we make it more difficult for ourselves in gaining support from the local communities? So yeah, it is a political crisis, but not because there's no possibility to organize the infrastructure, for example, or organize solidarity. It's because the topic has proved to be very lucrative to gain votes on the not only on the right on the right spectrum, but more and more also I hear that left-wing parties are catering to this right-wing ideas on asylum. So for me, that really is proof that it has become a political crisis and maybe also an ethical crisis.
We're seeing that in Los Angeles too, right? Because I think a lot of the situation there is going to be worse because of the intervention of troops there, because that will create its own reaction. You know, it reminds me of politicians who always said, never let a good crisis go to waste. But the second part of that is if you don't have a crisis, make one.
Yeah.
And then don't let it go to waste. And so we're seeing that. I'll give you another short example of this, is that the President Trump issued an order that cut off refugee admissions to the United States. And one of the things he did was to cut off funding for refugee resettlement agencies. The refugee resettlement agencies sued in court and said this is against the law to essentially abrogate a program that Congress authorized. The government is saying, well, you can't increase refugee admissions now because there's no capacity anymore to receive refugees, right? So we're going to take the money away, and then they don't have money. So should we admit refugees?
Yeah. So one of the books you make, one of the points you make in the book is the discretionary power of the government that is so big when it comes to border issues, and that also means, I guess, the discretion to not fix things that might be fixable. Wafa, can you tell us a little bit about the thing that happened this weekend with the citizens that really started to do their own border controls, and how the political reactions to that are maybe telling of the situation that we are in right now?
Yeah, so in Ter Apel, that is a small town in the Netherlands, in the northern eastern part of the Netherlands. There we have the only application center for asylum seekers, and this town has been battling issues because the application center is full, and it remains full because there's no there's insufficient willingness in the rest of the country to take on asylum seekers. And people who live in Ter Apel, because we're talking about Ter Apel, they have organized their own border control. And I want to reiterate, it's dangerous and racist and illegal. And then the Minister of Justice, who is now also one of the 3 ministers of asylum since today, he responded on X saying that he understands the sentiments of these these people who are issuing their own border control. But then, that really provoked a strong reaction. And we also saw it from Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the biggest political movement in the Netherlands, who let the government fall last week, cheering on and saying, actually, I want to participate next time. And instead of government calming down the sentiments in society and saying, hey, we have our own police and other mechanisms to protect our borders. And the fact that these people saw room for this is because they are being told that no one else is protecting them against the influx of migrants and asylum seekers. And what was really striking to me is that, for example, this reaction from Geert Wilders, you would say, at first glance, oh my God, he's really standing up for these people in Ter Apel. Whereas if you look at his track record and the track record of the whole coalition, they are not supporting measures that actually will help Ter Apel. For example, the spreidingswet. They want to revoke that law, which actually helps all provinces and municipalities to evenly, or at least more fairly distribute asylum shelter. It was adopted by Parliament, but as soon as it was adopted, even before that the Senate was able to adopt it, after the election results in November 23, the coalition parties actually said, we are going to revoke that law. So to summarize my point, Geert Wilders and the other politicians in the coalition, they pretend that they are on the side of Ter Apel, which is screaming for measures like the spreidingswet, while they're not doing anything practical to help them. It's just, stoking up.
And I think it's also such an interesting point because we've been talking about the immense power of the government and the violence they're able, and how build up the borders are, and how what fortifications and signs of power they are. And at the same time, there is this rhetoric constantly about how powerless they are. Like, we cannot control the borders, we cannot do anything about this. Nanda, can you say something about this? What's the function of this powerlessness, or this supposed powerlessness?
Well, I think it's important, and it has already been touched upon by Martijn in his introduction course, and also in your book, which I really like, that you cross boundaries between law, philosophy, and economy. I think it's very important to first indeed to see that it's a political crisis, not an asylum crisis. It was the same in 2015 when refugees from Syria came to Europe. That was also a political crisis, not a refugee crisis. So it's important to stress that it's a fabricated political crisis. And because of that, can be challenged and should be challenged. But it's also important, I think, and this is often overlooked in the academic debate and public debate on migration and asylum, to take into account the economic context. And this is what you try to do in your book. And more specifically, it's important to look into the political economy behind national borders. So what kind of political ideologies shape public spendings on walls, on reception centers, on national borders, and so on. And this is actually something that Hannah Arendt did in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that is highly influential in both public and academic debate, especially her reflections on the refugee crisis in Europe after the First World War. I think many of you read it. Who has read The Origins of Totalitarianism? Okay, then it's not that influential in public debate. Anyway, she has this 9th chapter in the Origins of Totalitarianism in which she analyzes the rightlessness and the degrading treatment of refugees in Europe after the First World War. But the interesting part is that her reflections on the refugee problem are part and parcel of her discussion of imperialism and global capitalism. So she sees she observes a very close link between imperialism and global capitalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the degrading treatment and the rightlessness that refugees received and had to suffer in Europe. And that's interesting, right? So she sees a connection between basically capitalism and the rightlessness of refugees. So in her view, there is nothing strange or contradictory between the fact that within imperialism that shatters capital, investment, the production of goods across the globe, and that refugees do not in any manner whatsoever profit from this world without borders, but are instead put into refugee detention camps. So the question I would like to ask to understand this situation is, what is the political economy behind our asylum and migration policies? If you allow me,
definitely. How would you answer that
question? I would. Yeah, I could make many observations, but let me make 3 observations, and I will try to make them briefly. And basically, behind these 3 observations is this basic question: who is getting rich? Because normally, when we're talking about migration and asylum, the question is always who is included, who is excluded, who belongs, who does not belong. But I think one of the important questions to ask is who's getting rich. So the first thing is that, as in Arendt's time, the political ideology that is still dominant today is the ideology of neo-imperialism and neoliberalism. And what we witness is a public disinvestment of public money in education, in housing, in labor programs, and so forth, that has pushed refugees in Europe and probably also in the United States, I'm not an expert on the United States, to the margins of our society. Because everything that is needed for the inclusion and integration of refugees...
So once they've arrived.
Sorry?
So once they
have arrived,
yeah.
Has been disinvested, like education, labor programs, integration. And this is most particularly clear in the disinvestment of reception centers, with the result that in one of the most affluent countries in Europe, Belgium and the Netherlands, we have substandard, overcrowded reception facilities for asylum seekers. So that's the first observation, that everything that is needed for successful integration has been disinvested. The second observation is that these neoliberal policies of deregulation, trade liberalization, privatization have also been pushed very powerful in the global south, with the help of the World Bank and the IMF. So what we have seen since the 1970s is that development aid and loans to the global south have been made contingent on those countries implementing neoliberal policies and restructuring their economies and political institutions. But also, and this is even more important, that those development programs and those loans have been made conditional upon those countries deterring refugees and migrants from coming to the global north. So what we have said is, okay, here is a pile of money you can use to modernize your economy, but on the condition that you keep refugees in your region of origin and prevent them from coming here. So that's the second point. The third point, and I'm making a link to what is happening in Los Angeles now in a minute. The third point is that these neoliberal and neo-imperial policies, this political ideology of global capitalism also fundamentally shapes how we respond to, but also understand migration and asylum. How we understand, for example, the refugee problem. So what we have seen, if you take a look at history, at the beginning of the international regime of refugee protection in the 1950s, the focus was on the legal protection of refugees, the legal rights of refugees that would enable their social, political, and economic integration within hosting countries. With the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s, our perception has changed. So the focus is no longer on legal protection, but the focus is on physical protection. And this matches this neoliberal ideology of social policies in which reliance upon the state is inherently undignified, to the effect that social policies can only allow for a minimalist humanitarian concern with the poor that provides in basic needs. So we see this shift from legal protection and integration to physical protection of refugees within the region of origin. So we no longer perceive refugees, and I'm talking about refugees because that's my area of expertise, as having rights, but as having needs. So if you now look at the protests in Los Angeles, there have been protests before in Los Angeles in the 1990s, where illegal immigrants and refugees were protesting their exclusion and marginalization within society. And they had a very interesting slogan. Their slogan was, do you know what their slogan was? It's also the title of a movie of...
A Day Without?
No, it's the title of a movie of Ken Loach, of course, Ken Loach. Their slogan was, we want bread, we want our basic needs fulfilled, that's true, but we want roses too. We want a fully human, dignified life. And I think that if we're talking about fair and more just policies, that we should also address this political economy of capitalism and imperialism and neoliberalism that is shaping our understanding of the world we're living.
I mean, some of that relates to my engagement, or a lot of people's engagement about what it means to address root causes, because so much of the impulse in the political horizon is to say we're going to send money, but then it easily gets captured by, goes to guards and guns and things of that nature instead of being true nation building. The other thought I had when you were speaking is that when you have a strong distinction between refugees and other people, other migrants, I think one of the things it does is it sees refugees only as people in need, or at least that's the most immediate thing. But of course, refugees, in many ways, I mean, one of the dilemmas of modern policy is it's hard to determine actually who's a refugee under the legal rules and legal definition, and when in fact, in many respects, refugees are also migrants. And that's especially true if you think about this in the dimension of time, right? Because I'm struck in Southern California, for example, and this has been replicated throughout the world, is that there was a time when we could speak of the Vietnamese refugee community. Well, in a generation, it becomes the Vietnamese immigrant community. And then beyond that, then it becomes a particular type of American community. And I think that there's a dimension of time that is lost. And so time is relevant in integration, time is relevant in the degree of patience, and time is also relevant in, if you think about the children of refugees, you don't think of them as people in need. You think of them as actors in the society. And so there's a impairment of perception by saying that this is all about refugees, right? It's about people on the move for various kinds of reasons.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit to the tension that has been mentioned already about the impossibility that certain politicians perceive in the law, whether those are refugee conventions or European law or the other kind, just the Raad van State or something, just like the rule of law within a country itself, and how what it tells us that, in a way, democracy is somehow pitched against the rule of law when it comes to issues of migration and refugees. Is that something you recognize, or?
Yeah, I recognize that in Parliament, and especially in the coalition arrangement, the rule of law is pitched against what the people want, the people's will. And today, for example, I was following an asylum debate in Parliament, and then I was like, okay, thank you, Claudia van Zanten from BBB, because I was going to make this point this evening. So the BBB is one of the coalition parties, and they're quite radical. And she was actually saying, we want to close the borders for asylum seekers, just like the Dutch government has done. And yes, a Dutch court said that this was illegal, but the Rijkskansler Merz said that they won't really abide to that ruling, and legal procedures will take years anyway, and in the meantime they will have reached their political goals. And she was actually proposing to do the same in the Netherlands, and then one of her opposition colleagues interrupted her and said, well, I am astounded. Like, what are you proposing to set aside the rule of law? But she's not alone in this. Claudia van Zanten from BBB. More and more, I hear from top politicians that, yeah, it's a bit annoying, and well, it's also just an opinion. What the Council of State has advised the government, and this was said by the former Minister of Asylum, Marjolein Faber, after having received a very critical advisory opinion from the Council of State on her two laws. Well, I'm not going to, I'm not going to change my laws according to their advisory opinion, because it's only an opinion. And also, I hear these talking points when it comes to human rights institutions, when it comes to executive organizations like COA and IND, the immigration services, they all want to frustrate us because they have problems with change, and change always comes with anxieties. Instead of recognizing that these institutions play a very important role in our democracy and the rule of law. And it's quite unnerving to see that more parties are, treating the rule of law and democracy as a menu.
Yeah, but not only the rule of law, but also a democracy. Because what you see with PVV and BBB, but also the VVD,
there are a lot of Dutch parties.
They are all Dutch parties at the right, of the spectrum. Is that what they claim to do? Is that they have access to the will of the people, while democracy is about navigating minority, majority, navigating those in power, men in power, laws in power. But what they claim is that they have access to the one and true only will of the people. And that is perhaps not even more dangerous, but as dangerous as undermining the rule of law. Because in democracy, it's about antagonism, it's about winning and losing and debating and pluralization of opinions, and so on, and not just one will of the people.
And who is the people? I always wonder.
Yeah,
because every party, also on the left of the political spectrum, they talk about the Dutch person, Dutch citizen, and I have no idea about whom they're talking or thinking. And what I also wanted to add to this, but I forgot, so it's fine.
Okay.
I was just going So in the book you have also some proposals about how we could go to a more fair and just migration policy. And one of the caveats that you add immediately is that some of them are indeed having to do with very significant underlying causes of the whole world, and that is not something that you change overnight. So that requires patience. And then we've been sketching this situation that gets more and more like a farce every day. But one of the key characteristics, I would say, is that that many politicians, whether they're Trump or Dutch politicians, is an impatience and, like we've been talking about, a crisis, a sense of immediacy. And you're saying it needs time.
Yeah.
How on earth are you ever going to get that together?
Yeah, I mean, this is some people. Some people have suggested my book is too realistic, and some people suggest that it's too utopian, and maybe that means I'm in a good spot. But I have to confess, first of all, I have the occupational hazard of most teachers, which is, I think, if people knew enough that they would actually agree with me, and that isn't always true. So I go back a little bit to what Matthew was saying about social movements too. Is I don't have a clear, here's the recipe answer, but I think there are things that fall in the category of the small steps. I mean, one is to understand the power of certain narratives and to identify them and to identify them. I think that the troops in Los Angeles reflect the invasion narrative. The opposite really is, here's how we build our community, and there are people in the community whose voices should be heard. We should not allow the border to basically tamp down, silence some people and to prioritize other people who have no connections or interest in someone coming in. So some of this is it's not an overnight thing, but I think more could be done that is being done now. I also think, and this really actually goes to I was thinking about this when you're saying that about law, is that law is important, but I think that the best lawyers understand the limitations of law and the limitations of lawyers. And so I think that there's also a certain degree of humility that's required in understanding that just having the better argument, even having the better policy, it may not reach anyone other than the people you're talking to already. So I actually deliberately wrote this in a way that says, I really wrote this in a way that tries to find people where they are. So I think that's another step. And then it's also a question of the audiences you reach, right? This is another aspect of the silos I mentioned in explaining the whole project, is that people get their news from so many different sources. So I think that's really one of the basic problems, which has its own solutions, but it's in own dimensions. But I think one of the most humbling things about maybe any of us who write is to think about the millions of people who don't read what we write, right? And that's really it's very sobering to me. I've spent, I guess, decades literally writing about this issue, but I had the experience. This is maybe it's typical Los Angeles, but I was asked to be on a humor show about migration. You may have heard of them, the Try Guys, and it kind of reminds you of Monty Python or something like this. I'm the straight man in this, and so I've been publishing these books and that kind of thing. And then the bottom line is that this 15-minute video, which is critical of immigration policy, has 8 million views. And it completely eclipses anything else I've ever done. So it makes you realize that it's partly the narrative, it's partly the small things, it's partly who you reach. And that's another aspect, as I mentioned, of the silos, that we can't just talk to the like-minded. And that's a key thing. But all of us is driven by a sense that there's a certain degree of direction of travel we need to go in, and it's not really a crisp answer to the patience question, but I think it is. And I take heart, in the falling of the Berlin Wall, like in Matthew's book, or a lot of other social movements that really did matter. And the irony of social movements is, I think, or anyone who is concerned about current events, is that on the one hand, it takes drive, it takes ambition, it takes a willingness to think beyond, but it also takes the humility to realize you're not doing it alone. And I think that combination of ambition and humility is sometimes hard for us to really internalize and act upon.
Yeah. Wafa, same question. If you look at Dutch politics, are there people or maybe specific debates or some areas where you do see the possibility for actual discussion that is not kidnapped by the crises rhetoric?
Well, there's two things that come to my mind when I hear Mr. Hiroshi talk. First, I was reminded of the State Commission for Demographic Development. I mean, they did a lot of research about the issue of migration, and not only asylum, but also for labor, for studying, for marrying, for love, you know. And then last year they came with their report, and I think one of the biggest conclusions was that the Dutch government or Dutch authorities, they need to come up with a vision. What is the role of migration in society, in Dutch society? How do we want to organize migration and use migration for the benefit of society? And well, I don't see that happening. So the government, you know, they read the conclusions and they promised that they will think about it. But so far, I haven't really seen that it's happening. The patterns of polarization are so deep. But I think they were correct, the State Commission, that we need a national discussion about migration and what do we want with it. And the second thing which comes to my mind is people just need to meet each other also. I'm not saying that, you know, all borders need to be opened for all billions of people in the world, but when I go when I go to different parts of the country other than Parliament in The Hague, and I speak with people or I visit asylum centers, people always tell me that as soon as the local communities come in touch with the asylum seekers that they have been so scared of, that actually people start embracing each other and just that coexisting is possible. And I always think of the examples of places where asylum centers were heavily protested, and then the center came regardless. And as soon as COA, the organization who is in charge of asylum shelter, decides to close the center, the same people who were protesting it were actually quite sad. And these are very positive stories, but I also think that they bear a lot of truth to them. Meet each other. It sounds very idealistic, but I think that othering people, it's not a solution. So that's a very practical tip, maybe for for people.
Nanda, keeping in mind that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, as they say. What kind of room do you see for hope, to answer Martijn's question?
Room for hope. Well, make visible the costs of border protection, of exclusion, migrants and refugees. That's a very good point to start with. But also linking up to what you say, Wafa, I don't think it's idealistic, but realistic, because I'm reminded of the 2015...
I became very cynical, working in a school.
Yeah, sorry. When the refugees from Syria came to Europe and also to the Netherlands, and there was a reception center being opened in Tilburg, where I live. And the media coverage of it was like, there's a huge protest. This was not true. What happened was that people who were welcoming refugees, they went into the neighborhoods where the reception center was being erected, and they went to 1,000 families with a simple question. First, do you like to welcome refugees and help us? Then you were put in a green box. Do you have doubts about refugees coming to our city. Okay, you have doubts. That was indeed a large proportion of the people in Tilburg. And the arguments they presented was like, well, the refugees get bikes while we don't have money to give bikes to our children. So one of the solutions was make bikes for everyone. And then only a small portion of the people said, no, we don't want refugees, we hate them, and we're not going to help them, and we're going to fight the erection of the reception facility center for refugees. So this was like, you know, it was really a small portion, but it was blown up in the media. So I think that media coverage of local initiatives who are welcoming and supporting, or maybe not at first, is also very important. And to end with your book, I think, and this sounds very moralistic, sorry, I don't want to sound moralistic at all, but you draw attention to the fact that injustice is being done. Yeah. And we cannot be indifferent to injustice. Right. It's not a failure of human rights that refugees are without rights. It's not a failure of law, it's injustice. And with respect to injustice, you cannot be indifferent, because then you actually contribute to passive injustice.
Could I just
so
identify?
We need to resist. Yeah.
I just want to identify something that I think emerges in both your it's a dilemma, and I think it's worth naming the dilemma, and that is the difference between local perceptions and decision making, and national decision making. And in one respect, I think that a lot of times it's the national level treating people more as statistics that makes it easier to enact policies that do injustice. And so a lot of times the politics and perceptions change when you go local, right? Yeah. This is a little bit of what you're saying. And I think that's, if there's ever going to be partisan gridlock in a partisan strong party system going to be broken, it's going to be because in the States, Republican mayors will decide that they need immigrants too, right? Yeah. And it's the person who's your neighbor. And so this is the local perceptions, and therefore local decision making creates a change in how you see the issue. Here's the dilemma, though. The dilemma is that if you were to take the position that everything should be done locally, then you get to the private patrols, then you create a zone where the empowerment of local government can create zones of unaccountability.
And making new borders.
Yeah. And right, and so it can lead to racial profiling and policing and things like that. So the dilemma is how do you activate and move past the current gridlock of politics by mobilizing local perceptions, but not create zones where that local border then becomes weaponized to replicate the injustice in a different way, right? And so that's I just want to name that as a dilemma, because it's the benefit, but also the great disadvantage of local decision making. And the larger in large countries with huge variations in both culture and budget, and depending on the country and language, then you're going to have this dilemma to navigate.
Thank you. I want to open up the discussion. I have room for a couple of questions. Maybe there are people who want to ask something. You can also ask something to Martijn or Matthew, if there's anyone.
Behind you.
Oh, behind.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to sound cynical, but is it actually in the interest of government to solve the refugee crisis? Because, to be honest, when we look in the grand scheme of things, objectively, it's a small issue. But it's a very good scapegoat and a way to focus interest and attention of people away from government failure and incompetence. It's a lot easier to blame the refugee for the lack of housing than to basically own to 30 years of disastrous housing policy, for instance.
My answer is that there are a lot in government who don't want to solve the crisis, right? I mean, I think that's very true. And I think that it also comes back to the idea that we're going to, I'm saying some people in government, including people in our White House, really want to create a narrative about the border as protecting us from invaders. One of the things that that I talk about a little bit in the book is that there was a time when I think migration policy in a lot of countries, I think, was really about how do we deal with people who are newcomers inside or inside the country. In the United States, it would be the undocumented population. What are the rights of the undocumented? 2015, in many parts of the world, created an opportunity to then really rethink this. It's not about who's living in our communities and cooking our food or whatever, but we can really take advantage of the fact that there are the caravans coming in. And so I don't know if that's cynical or just realistic, But I also think it's worth naming and fighting against.
I would like to add to this that courts in the Netherlands, but also I don't know how to say it in English, but he's called the Nationale Ombudsman, and other human rights institutions. They have been signaling for years that the inability of politicians to solve big problems, for example, the housing problem, a nitrogen crisis, asylum. Adds to the distrust in the legal system, because then judges need to, they need to come with a ruling about how the government actually should act in these crises, and it also adds to the distrust of, distrust in politics, because people more and more see that politicians are not able to solve the problems, and this helps populist parties because they have this very black and white solution. I think you're correct when you ask the government is actually adding to the crisis because they're not able to come with a solution. And I think in the Netherlands it's because we have such a fragmented political arena, and everyone is competing with each other.
Thank you. Is there someone else who has a question? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering on the topic of scapegoat politics. Of course, now migration is one of the biggest topics, but like we've talked about the crises, like it's always something else. And I think we've also discussed the power of rhetoric and the power of basically storytelling. A lot of the right does and the scapegoat politics they employ. So I was wondering how we as a society can combat this, because the left also lacks a lot of this rhetoric as well, partially due to a lot of nuance as well, but therefore that's also a reason why they've been not as successful. So I was wondering what your vision was on that.
This is when we all look at each other for...
Yeah. Anyone wants to give it a try, or are we...
Well, I mean, I do think, and I do think that a coherent affirmative vision that takes into account all the political vulnerabilities, instead of going ahead and deciding that some people are not worth listening to, I mean, I think that's a start. I think it's an important start. And I think another important start is to pursue multiple means of I don't want to say education, because that implies this kind of top-down thing, but of giving people multiple ways to exchange views. I mean, I don't. As I say that, I don't know if I'm being overly optimistic or not, or overly utopian or not enough. I'm really. Again, I don't have so much a recipe as much as saying I think we need to have these conversations, including. And some of the best conversations I've had are much more in a town hall meeting where people really disagree. Sometimes we're too afraid to disagree sometimes, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I agree that we should make room again for disagreement. We can have opposing views on immigration. We can have opposing views on how to best protect refugees. We can have opposing views whether the distinction between migrants and refugees is valid at all. But we should not escalate it, weaponize it, and dehumanize the other in doing so. And I think it's also important that we often think that things are unavoidable and natural and necessary, but we should be really aware of the fact that everything that is happening is the result of political decisions. And everything that is the result of a political decision can be contested and can be changed. So that is a small glimmer of hope. Yeah.
I want to add to this that I also think that the reason maybe that politicians are not able to... okay, let me retract that. I think the reason that the narrative is so distorted and fragmented is also because we live in a society of alternative facts, which is caused also by algorithms and the spread of disinformation. And I'm not an expert on this, but I can really see the reality Parliament lives in, social media, and the real world. So when I go into society and talk with people about it, they're much more nuanced than what you might think when you only read social media posts and watch the clips of fights in Parliament. So I think it's also a digital issue. But I'm not an expert on this, and I know that there are experts in the audience, but this is not the time for it, I'm afraid.
Matthew, do you want to add something to that or not? I thought you were trying to catch my... Okay, if there's one last question, then...
I wanted to ask a question to Hiroshi about the college campus, specifically the U.S. college campus. It's a horrifying thing to watch, and it's a space where social movements begin, and they're not safe there anymore. So what is the responsibility? Because you talked at some point about how sobering it is to know that millions of people aren't reading your work and absorbing it, but these are the people that are reading your work and absorbing it, and they're responding, and they're being silenced.
Well, I have to say that the situation on U.S. campuses right now is very grim. And because I think what's happened is the administration has, there's several things that have really bothered, the people now in power in the White House and the executive branch. One of them is immigrants, and the other, I think, is higher education. And so to try to take away the tax-exempt status of Harvard, or Harvard's just a specific target, but also to say that they cannot have international students. I mean, this is done entirely with disregard for education and research. So that's one level of answer. I think another level of answer is that I think people are afraid. They're concerned about what they'll say, and the consequences of what they'll say. And this is not just people who have have an immigration status or a student, or we've even seen permanent residents arrested for speech that's clearly protected by the United States Constitution. And so I think we're in a society where people are afraid of what they're going to say, and I think that permeates the university, which clearly should not be in that situation. But we're also seeing this actually, if you really want to list all the places where damage is being done. We've seen this in getting rid of all the vaccine experts at the Centers for Disease Control, right? So we've had this. The university is, in that sense, a place where this is really happening, and there's degrees of self-censorship. There's one degree of self-censorship because you don't say something, or you're careful about who you say it to. But there's another degree of self-censorship which is much more administrative and almost bureaucratic. I mean, right now, university administrators are saying, going around to faculty saying, well, don't use the word diversity, call it something else. And so that's a bureaucratic, well, I don't mean to, I'm just being descriptive, calling it, it's saying that we're going to, that's a good word. It's an institutional censorship, and it makes you realize that some universities are so dependent on federal grant funding. You know, and then, so we'll have to see what happens, but I mean, I think a lot will depend on the outcome of the midterm elections, you know, in 2026, and whether the Democratic Party takes control of the House, which doesn't change the White House, of course, but I think it would be a significant impediment to what the administration is trying to do. But I'm really glad for the question about the universities, because it is a place where immigration policy and educational policy come together in a way that's certainly really bad right now. I'm not sure. I'm sorry
yeah, it's really bad. I think that's kind of like a summary, also maybe of the evening. But
well, no, I mean,
hopefully not of what you said. No,
we can talk about hope.
The conditions in the world. No, yeah.
We can talk about hope.
We have talked about hope also, luckily, and I also hope that people take that home for a little bit as well. I want to thank all my speakers: Martijn Strongs, Matthew Longo, Nanda Audians, Wafa Al-Ali, and of course, Hiroshi Motomura. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.